The entry of the Ottoman Empire in November 1914 on the side of Germany and Austro-Hungary marked a key change in the First World War. The Allied powers now had an enemy that stretched further east, one which posed a serious threat to the Suez Canal, Britain's vital shipping lane between Europe and Asia. So, in February 1915, an ambitious plan was launched. British and French forces, with reinforcements from Australia and New Zealand, planned to seize control of the Dardanelles Strait on modern-day Turkey's Gallipoli Peninsula. The goal? To knock out the Ottoman Empire. Yet what followed was over 10 months of fighting in brutal conditions. Casualties were heavy on both sides, but in January 1916, the last remaining Allied troops were evacuated, marking an Ottoman victory. I'm James Hanson, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every week we focus on a different historical battle, and with the help of our experts, we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today, it's the Gallipoli campaign, a costly failure for the Allies and a huge moment of importance in Turkish history. Yet how consequential was it? And what could an Allied victory there have looked like? That's a question for our experts. And joining me once again in the studio are the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, and the historian and researcher at the Tank Museum, Chris Copson. Welcome to you both. Well, in front of us here we have a big map of continental Europe as it would have been at the start of 1915. One thing to note, Bulgaria here is listed as a central power. It wasn't actually on the side of the Central Powers at this point, but you can see obviously red denotes the Central Powers of Germany, Austro-Hungary, and obviously the Ottoman Empire as well. Yellow denotes the neutral countries, and then of course green for the Entente or the Allied powers. Chris Copson, to start with you, set the scene for us here. I mean, at this point in 1915, the Allies are bogged down in the Western Front.
Yeah. What I'd like to do there is actually go back another stage, back to the start of the war, August 1914. Now, the thing that you have to remember about the First World War is it didn't turn out like anybody imagined. In 1914, they're expecting mobile warfare, where you have armies consisting of cavalry, infantry, artillery, where they move around the landscape, bump into one another, that's a battle. Instead, after the first few weeks, that doesn't happen. The Battle of the Marne is fought. The German army is stopped in its tracks. There's a period called the race for the sea. The German army is aiming for Paris. They can't go there. So they're leapfrogging, heading for the coast, trying to outflank one another. Then they hit the coast, and that still hasn't happened. So it bogs down. And this, of course, as everybody will know, is where trench warfare starts. And it's a line of fixed fortifications from Nieuwpoort on the Belgian coast, right the way down, taking most of Belgium, a slice of eastern France, down to the Swiss frontier. That doesn't move substantially for the rest of the war. Other battles are fought. I mean, there are some fairly spectacularly bad ones in the early stages of the war. Ober's Ridge, Festubert, Loos. But it's becoming obvious that we have a stalemate. And at the moment, we don't know how to break it. So we start to look elsewhere. Now, we're not just fighting Germany. As you've alluded, we're fighting the Triple Alliance. So we have Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey. So if you can't take on Germany successfully, let's look elsewhere. And the phrase, the soft underbelly, creeps in. So how can we go about taking on Turkey? Freeing up the Suez Canal from any danger and unbalancing the Triple Alliance. This is where the concept of the Gallipoli campaign originates.
Did it make sense, Chris Parry, to go, you know what, let's try and knock out the Ottoman Empire and then we can advance on Austria-Hungary, we can advance on the German Empire from there?
Yes, strategically, it's a great idea. The execution is the problem. So what had been happening ever since the Crimean War, in fact, is British interest had been focused on the Dardanelles Straits in Constantinople. In fact, in 1904 and 1911, the Imperial General Staff and the Navy had actually said, look, we might have to do this one day. So here are a couple of plans. And if you look at the Gallipoli Peninsula, which is a very rugged, hilly, mountainous sort of peninsula, we'd actually built a line of fortifications there in 1854 when we'd been engaged in the Crimean War. So we should have actually known what we were letting ourselves in for. What we were trying to do initially is find a way of either splitting the European part of the Ottoman Empire off from the rest of it, or alternatively, an operation against a place called Alexandretta, which is down here, to split the empire away from what is going on in the Middle East, in what we now call Palestine and Arabia and places like that. So we were looking at ways in which we could weaken and also distract the Ottoman Empire. But the key issue here is that we can actually not only have access to our allies, the Russians, but also be able to supply the Russians as well. Because if you look at it, the Russians are pretty isolated by the Central Powers. We can't go through the Baltic. We can't go through the Black Sea at the moment. And if you go here to supply, it's mostly icebound in the north. So we can't actually supply the Russians. So what we're trying to do is two things, is to split the Turks either in Europe and its Asiatic component, either to interdict so they can't interfere down here. And the key issue down here, of course, is we've just converted the Royal Navy from coal to oil. So we want to get our hands on the Iranian oil fields, basically, and secure our position in the Middle East. So there's all sorts of reasons for heading in this direction. We think we know Gallipoli. We've got a big base in Egypt close by. So we think, yeah, we can build up forces in Egypt, and this looks like a good option. We've had our Navy in the Black Sea before. We've been successful. We sort of know it. We don't actually have the latest maps or intelligence, though, but hey, we've been here before. We'll have a crack at it.
Well, as you can see on our map, Gallipoli is pretty small. So I tell you what, let's zoom in and let's look at the Dardanelles campaign in detail. OK, we've got a new map now. This is the Gallipoli Peninsula, this long stretch of land here. These are the Dardanelles Straits. You get up to the Gallipoli Strait, and then, of course, you've got the Sea of Marmara leading up to Constantinople as it was then, Istanbul as it is now, and then up to the Black Sea. So that's the lay of the land. Now, you'll note on this map we've got red blocks denoting the Ottomans, and we've got green blocks denoting the Allies. We'll come on to the amphibious invasion in a moment, but of course the first part of the Gallipoli campaign, Chris Parry, is the naval operation. So just talk us through that.
Well, I think we've got to understand that this was actually the main part of the campaign. And if it had been successful, there wouldn't have been a need for such heavy landings. So the original plan was that we would actually get, together with the French, a large number of old battleships, those that weren't good for fleet actions. They're what we call the pre-dreadnoughts, up to 18 of them, French and British battleships. And what they would do is silence the forts, and they're on both sides here of the Straits. And we've got to remember that this is about 36 miles long, all the way through into the Sea of Marmara here. And the idea was silence the forts. We'll also put some Marines ashore to silence mobile batteries and things like that, and also guard the shore as we are taking our warships up here to threaten Constantinople and obviously threaten it. Now, one of the things that people had in mind was the Battle of Copenhagen, Nelson's battle then. So you get opposite Constantinople, you say, look, if you don't cooperate, we're going to bombard the city. And that was going to be the plan. Now, the issue was that the Navy anticipated there would be mines in this area. They had intelligence, the Turks had mines, and they had extensive minefields here. So they had minesweepers that actually went in and cleared the mines. And the issue was that they were being engaged by the shore batteries and these mobile artillery. So that was a bit of a problem. What then added to the mix was that a Turkish mine layer called the Nusrat actually laid some mines a bit later than the other mines. The minesweepers actually didn't have a chance to clear them, and suddenly there was a huge explosion. The battleship Bouvet, French battleship, keeled over and sank. And the whole bombardment operation was threatened by the fact that the battleships kept on running into mines. And the losses were such that they realised that without being able to clear the mines, they weren't going to be able to go up the straits at all. And this is in February. It starts on the 19th of February, and they have two cracks at it, one in February, the second in March, and they're continuing to lose mines. Then there's a rumour that the Turks and the Germans might have submarines in the area. So they have to take precautions against submarines. That includes putting torpedo nets out, even while the ships are underway and bombarding the shore. But they have a good crack, actually, between February and March, and actually taking out the forts. The forts are disabled. The Turks are running out of ammunition, and the prospects are actually quite good at that stage. But the naval commanders lose their nerve, and the naval commander Carden is replaced by a chap called de Robeck. And the thinking is, look, this is getting too risky now. We knew it was hazardous. It's too risky with minefields we don't know about, potential for submarines. We're getting bombarded ourselves from the shore. We need the army to come in and help.
Well, let's bring you in, Chris Copson, on that point. I mean, they obviously decide, OK, plan A hasn't quite worked. Let's go for plan B. Talk us through the amphibious invasion of Gallipoli.
Right. So what happened is that, as Chris has just said, the naval campaign has failed. One of the problems is that, I mean, they've been very successful at reducing the coastal forts. Places like Saddlebar Castle down on the tip, even today it's a mound of ruins. But the Turks are using howitzer batteries. They've moved them up into the hills. And a howitzer is a high trajectory weapon. So they're actually able to drop rounds onto the decks, the unarmoured decks of these warships. In fact, the Bouvet hits a mine, and there's evidence, some friends who've dived on her, that she's also been hit by a howitzer round that convincingly put her on the bottom. So the thought is, OK, we need troops ashore. We have got a force of roughly 78,000 mixed. We've got the 29th Division. We have got Anzacs, the Australian New Zealand Army Corps. We're going to put them ashore.
And the Royal Naval Division.
And the Royal Naval
Division. Yeah.
The R&D are interesting. They are surplus sailors who have been retrained as infantrymen, and they play quite a role here, and they go on to the Battle of the Ancre on the Western Front on the Somme. The problem is really going to be how do we get them ashore? Well, we've got the ships, but this isn't D-Day. There aren't any landing craft. There are lighters, which are basically open boats. Later on, they armour some of them up with a bit of a bulletproof superstructure called them Beetles. But they do also come up with quite a novel solution. There is a 1,000-ton collier called the River Clyde, which becomes the ship of Troy. And what they're going to do with the Clyde is to ram her into the beach down at Siddle Bar, and there are boarding ramps for the Lancashire Fusiliers, amongst others, to scramble down and actually get onto the shore. So far, so good. But General Sir Ian Hamilton, who's in charge of all this, hasn't had the chance to do much of a reconnaissance, and what he has done has been from the deck of a ship somewhere offshore, probably around about Imbros, with a telescope. And
also, almost all the literature in terms of the topography has been provided by travel guides. They aren't ordnance survey maps and things like that. Yeah. And the critical thing is there is a gap between the end of the naval operation and the start of the landings from March until April. And the Turks say, in all the memoirs, they say that 4 weeks actually saved us because we dug in, we got lots more ammunition down there, we got more troops down from Constantinople, and that 4 weeks actually is the decisive issue. If we'd been able to do it in synchronised way rather than sequentially, this would have been a different campaign.
Yeah. So, going on from that, the landings are concentrated around here, Cape Helles, and that is 29th Division, and there's a subsequent landing that's happening at the same time up at Anzac Cove, which is just there. So they come ashore, the Turks are waiting. I think the problem here is there's a considerable underestimation of the Turkish fighting man, the Turkish soldier. The thought is that they will not fight, they'll run away. And to some extent, they've put up a couple of very bad performances, really, in the Italo-Turkish war, in Serbia. So the thought is that they're not of particularly good quality and we won't have any problems. That is actually quite the reverse, because when the landings start down at Suvla, the Turks are waiting, machine guns mounted, and the sea around there, and there's a Royal Naval Air Service pilot who reports this, the sea turned red with blood. Guys are cut down trying to get ashore, and there's an extraordinary piece of footage of the River Clyde, the steamer, with some lighters in front, and it's littered with black shapes, which are guys have been shot down actually coming onto the shore.
Chris, I think it's worth mentioning that the Turkish Fifth Army, which is actually defending the Gallipoli Peninsula, is largely officered by Germans.
Yes.
And it's actually commanded by a 60-year-old called Liman von Sanders. And he's been training the Turkish troops for some time now. And what is underestimated is the extent to which the Germans were supporting the Turks. At the start of the war, 2 German warships were trapped in the Mediterranean, a battlecruiser called Goeben and a cruiser called the Breslau. And the Royal Navy had tried to sort of trap them. And what the Germans did is said to the Turks, look, we'll give you the Goeben and the Breslau to operate in the Black Sea. You can operate them as Turkish ships. We'll man them if you come in on our side. And so the German involvement in this is very, very critical. And if you look at the numbers of officers who are actually commanding in these Turkish divisions, there's a very large number of them.
Yeah, there are some very good, competent German officers backing up the Turks. I think the thing we haven't really sort of dealt with so far is just the actual terrain, because the Gallipoli Peninsula is horrific. It really is. I mean, if you are coming ashore at Anzac, you're stepping onto the beach, and immediately behind you, you've got all these Australian, New Zealand troops. There's a cliff about 100 feet high called the Sphinx. The only route inland are through gullies, and these are narrow, confined, ideal for ambush, ideal for machine guns, and they're choked with this stuff called turkey oak as well. And I've bushwhacked my way through that, and I can tell you it's like nature's barbed wire.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what happens both at Anzac and the group of 4 beaches around Suvla is that things grind to a halt. We do push the Turks back as far as Krithia, but then everything really does grind to a halt. And we're into trench warfare. So what's happening on the Western Front is now happening here.
The one thing that we were trying to avoid, we were trying to not replicate what's going on the Western Front, is now happening in Gallipoli. We'll come on in a moment, Chris Parry, to how the Gallipoli campaign may have played out differently. And as a former amphibious commander, I'd be fascinated to get your thoughts on that. But we get to the point, over Christmas in 1915, there's huge pressure politically back home in Britain. It's obvious that the Gallipoli campaign is failing. When do they make the decision, we need to get out?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, if you look at it, we started off with 5 divisions in here. We end up with 15 committed to this. And the Turks similarly start off with 6 divisions and end up with 16. So it's a major trap for these forces. Now, there's another crack at using the Navy to help bombard Turkish positions. The really critical issue happens around August time when the Turks start getting deliveries of very heavy German artillery. They're able to shell our positions and things like that. The disease dysentery particularly, is starting to take hold of the troops. The climate, as you can imagine, is absolutely awful. One of the things that everybody complains about is the insects and things like that. Lots of people being injured, as you can imagine. And Hamilton, the general, is relieved. And the new commander gives the advice, Charles Munro, look, this is not going to be a successful campaign. And towards the end of the year, it's quite clear the objectives are not going to be achieved. Just as an aside, what has been incredibly successful has been the submarine campaign. French and British submarines have made their way up into the Sea of Marmara. They have completely cut off the maritime supply for the Turks to the peninsula. And indeed, one of our submarines, E-11, has made it to Constantinople and has shelled the city with its gun. And we've had a Turkish battleship torpedoed. And quite a lot of Victoria Crosses have been won at sea, where the submarines have gone under the minefields. They've taken on the batteries when they've been on the surface. Some have been sunk, but very successful. The other big successful area is the Royal Naval Air Service, which is all over this campaign in terms of reconnaissance and keeping any Turkish aircraft away at the same time. But having said that, on land, people are getting killed, people get injured, disease. It's a wasting exercise. And as Chris says, this is attritional battle. We didn't want this at all. Oh, and by the way, Bulgaria's just come in on the side of the war on Turkey, Germany and Austro-Hungary's side, on the other side. And by now, the credibility of Churchill, who proposed this in the UK, the French are involved in a minor way in terms of their navy and some of their troops, but not many. And also Kitchener as well. Their credibility over this is declining. So politically back home, you see all the newspapers at the time, they're saying, what we're doing here.
Well, Churchill's left government by the time you get to Christmas 1915, and of course the Liberals have had to go into coalition with the Conservatives.
Churchill gets to carry the can for this in many ways. I'm not entirely sure I agree with that, because for this to happen in the first place, he had to run it past the War Cabinet, and that is Kitchener and Lloyd George and Asquith. All these guys had to say, not, Winston, I don't think it's one of the better ideas, go and lie down. They actually had to say, no, let's go for it.
I mean, strategically, there's nothing wrong with it. It's a really good idea. I'm afraid the execution has gone wrong. And what has gone wrong, as we mentioned earlier, it's been a sequential campaign, not a synchronised campaign. They haven't got the intelligence. They haven't got the supplies worked out. And one of the other big issues we haven't discussed is just getting this supplied and actually how the logistics going to work once you do break in ashore. But we shouldn't underestimate, as Chris hinted earlier, that the Turks, actually stiffened by the Germans, are serious opposition in this terrain.
That's a very good point. It's a common theme on History Undone, the kind of underestimating of your opponent, hubris, and that definitely plays a part.
Well, the enemy gets a vote.
Well, absolutely, yeah.
Just taking this sort of conclusion, I think the best thing about this campaign was the way we got out of it.
Yeah.
Because you have these landings at Suvla, at Anzac. There's another one up here at Suvla Bay. Extracting yourself from contact in the face of the enemy is incredibly difficult. But we do it. It's done gradually. We withdraw from first one front, then another. There are some clever devices. Somebody comes up with this idea that you prop a rifle up in a trench, loaded and cocked, with a tin of water hanging on the trigger, or a tin, and then water drops into it. The Turks, for the most part, are still convinced we're there. Hours after we've left.
Fires and stoves being sort of putting smoke out. Scurry is the guy who invents the self-firing rifle.
He was an Aussie, wasn't he?
Yes,
Australian.
We lose, I think we lost hardly anybody. There's a sailor who's killed when a magazine detonates prematurely because we're disposing of stores on the beach. But essentially, the best thing about this campaign, after all those months, and the last part of it's been horrific, the blizzard in November. I mean, you're thinking Mediterranean here. No, it's horrific. You get guys actually drowning in their trenches. Massive outbreaks of disease, dysentery. Getting out of it was absolutely the right thing.
Well, yeah, we get 35,000 men off. We get 32,000 injured as well. And as you say, Chris, it's an amazing withdrawal under fire and an absolute object lesson in how to do it, to tell you the truth.
Well, there we go. That's the real history of the Gallipoli campaign. Now let's undo all of that history. This is History Undone. Right, let's ask ourselves now, could things have played out differently with the Gallipoli campaign? And if they did, what would the long-term historical consequences have been? Dr. Chris Parry, you're a pretty perfect person to talk to about this. As a Navy man, a Rear Admiral, a former Amphibious commander, you said that strategically, you actually think the idea of this campaign is right. How could they have executed it better?
Well, I think there are two aspects to this, James. I think they should have held their nerve with the naval aspects of this. They were succeeding. They demolished the forts. They landed. They were actually having success against the mobile artillery. And I think they should have said, look, we knew we were going to lose some of these ships. That's why we put these old battleships in here. Let's sort out the mines. Let's find out exactly what we can do here in these straits. Now, in terms of the amphibious landings, the Turks actually, in fact, the Germans actually anticipated on behalf of the Turks that Cape Helles would be the point at which you're going to land. And you could probably forecast that as well. So if I'm thinking about this and how I'm planning that, these are perfect beaches for a demonstration or a feint. I'm going to land here. Just here, look.
So you would, let's put a few Allied blocks on the map. So you would have landed there. So not Anzac Cove, not Cape Helles, you'd have landed up here.
Yep, and I would have basically closed the neck of the bottle and said, fine, if you guys want to play in there, you're not being supplied by the main route. I'm going to put my submarines in here and I'm going to stop you being supplied by land. We'll just see how long you last. And I would have looked to reinforce with army units in here, and I'd have worked my way down the peninsula rather than up it.
It's interesting that just about where you put those blocks, there's a major line of Turkish Cold War period bunkers, because they realised the importance of that spot. I might have gone slightly different. I mean, assuming that we're not succeeding here or here, the third landing at Suvla, we're coming ashore there. That is actually something called the Tujla. It's a salt lake and it's dry in summer. But when we land there, there's practically no opposition, a handful of gendarmes. But we sit on the beach for far too long and get the Turks, give the Turks time to actually occupy the Anafata Hills here. And then we're penned in again. If we'd actually just cut inland as quickly as we possibly could, we'd have had a lot more success. There are tracks through this. It's not a very pleasant place, but we could certainly have cut these supply lines. And that might have made a bit of a difference as well.
That would be really interesting. Chris Parry, the numbers of troops that were committed, I think Churchill originally said we can do it with 50,000. I think Kitchener said it should be about 70,000. In the end, it was over 100,000. Had we started with over 100,000, would that have made a difference?
Yeah, but again, it's where you place them. And if you put 100,000 people on that beach and they stay there, they're going to die. It's what you do with these things that are really important. And I think one of the things that really disappoints me about the Gallipoli campaign is the way the whole idea of getting bogged down, as on the Western Front, takes hold of the commanders. They revert almost immediately to what they've seen on the Western Front. Now, let's be honest here, the topography is not great. So why do you go there? This is why I would go here. We get back to the point, the intelligence, any idea of what the topography looked like was done in a very slapdash, amateurish way. And yet, the Royal Naval Air Service, right from the word go, was saying, look, there's a better option here. People were coming back from flights saying, look, there's no Turks here, and the topography is actually much better. And the way in which people coordinated the information was an object lesson in how not to do it. And I'm afraid to say, in an authoritarian organisation where the information isn't going up from the bottom, you're going to end up with this sort of crisis. And one of the big complaints by the Australians is precisely that.
Yeah.
Nobody's listening to my mates.
And Chris Copson, I suppose the key point is, the Allies should not have underestimated the Turks to the extent that they did.
No, that's absolutely right. They should have anticipated the fact that the Turks would stand and fight. And one of the Turkish commanders in particular, the guy who became known as Kemal Ataturk, he was a divisional commander, a colonel at the time, is a colossal motivator. He became a massive figure in Turkish politics after the war. But this is a guy who turns around to his command and says, right, we're out of ammunition, but you've still got bayonets. You're going to fight. I expect you'll die, but the guys who come after us will throw the enemy back into the sea.
This is like Chamberlain at Little Round Top at Gettysburg.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Ataturk. I have a feeling we're going to talk about him quite a bit. Let's come on to some of the big long-term historical consequences. Had the Gallipoli campaign succeeded, Dr. Chris Parry, I suppose a lot of people talk about what it means for Churchill. This was seen as his great failure. He leaves the government as a result of it. He goes off and fights in the Western Front. If this succeeds, presumably he stays in the government, he stays in the cabinet. And does he end up becoming Prime Minister? Who knows, 20 years before he eventually does in 1940?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, there's quite a big pot to open there, isn't there? I mean, the first thing is that Asquith survives as Prime Minister. That's the point. Churchill's in that cabinet. Lloyd George probably doesn't become Prime Minister. So that thing changes. But you're right, if this is chalked up to Churchill, and Chris hinted earlier that Churchill became the scapegoat, and you know, there's that saying that success has 100 fathers and failure is an orphan. So had this been a success, you know, there would have been a lot of sort of stuff.
It may not have been Churchill's victory in the way it was Churchill's defeat.
So he might not have got it. But the fact of life is Churchill would have got a boost from this. And he may have been like Gladstone. He had quite a long career in politics, even up to and including the Second World War. But the issue is, and I think we can discuss it later, is if Gallipoli had succeeded, would the Second World War actually have happened?
OK, so just talk us through that.
OK, so, I mean, you've got a situation, I think, where if Gallipoli is successful, if Turkey is convinced that it doesn't need to be in the war anymore, that means you've got another front opening up against Austria-Hungary through the Balkans. In fact, one of the options that was being considered after Gallipoli was a landing at Salonika in northern Greece that would actually go through that route. Now, if you are pressurising Austria-Hungary and Germany from that route, you might be going for an early armistice in 1916. You don't have to do the Somme. You don't have to do those major assaults that create so many casualties. And you may have actually had a stabilisation of the First World War based on the three-front war that Germany will be facing, the West, the Russians, and from the southeast. Now, if that happens, the whole future of Europe is different. The other issue is if Turkey remains undefeated, but in fact surrenders, it can still hang on to what it's got in the Middle East. So there's no Lawrence of Arabia, there's no Arab revolt. Kut al-Amara, which is a defeat of British forces in the Middle East, doesn't happen. The Turks actually run down their empire in an ordered way rather than a disordered way. And who knows what would have happened? The whole map of Europe changes at that point.
So many what-ifs coming up already. We'll return to the Middle East in a bit. Chris Copson, I want to bring you in. Let's just unpick that. Let's say the First World War, therefore, ends in, 1916.
Yes.
You don't get the Treaty of Versailles with its punishing terms on Germany. Do you agree with Dr. Chris Parry that, therefore, maybe the Second World War doesn't happen because you don't get the rise of Nazi Germany?
I think that could be very near the truth. Yeah. I mean, as you just said, one of the main factors in the rise of Hitler is the resentment felt because of the Treaty of Versailles. So that's certainly a possibility. Austria-Hungary. I mean, Austria-Hungary was, even then, it was known as the sick man of Europe in partnership with Turkey at times. But it was a mess. If the Austro-Hungarian Empire had been unpicked, that changes things again. The other thing, and I'm going to steal Chris's thunder a little bit here, because I'm going to mention something that he hasn't so far. If this had been successful, we have a supply route all the way through here, right the way through the Sea of Marmara, the Black Sea. We are able to supply Russia.
The other interesting point, of course, is we've drawn off quite a lot of Turkish divisions away from the Russian front to actually defend Gallipoli. If Turkey is out of the war, the pressure on Russia reduces. Now, I believe the Russian Revolution would have occurred anyway because of the internal problems that have occurred, but it wouldn't have occurred because of the pressure from the First World War on Russia and its armies. So the character of that revolution would have been different in Russia. Well, no, I mean, it may well have been that actually you'd had a revolutionary transition of the Tsarist regime rather than a Bolshevik toppling of the Tsarist regime. So you've got a situation where Russia changes, and we've got to forget that Russian industry was doing really well before the First World War. It was actually starting to compete with Germany and Britain and France and the others. And so there were lots of positive signs. And the Bolsheviks only really get an angle in 1917 because Lenin is taken to Russia by the Germans, who would have been out of the war by that stage. They wouldn't have had the leverage if it hadn't been for mutinies in the Navy and the Army as a result of what's happened in the war. So you have a totally different political transition in Russia.
So, some absolutely enormous what-ifs here. Not only are we saying the First World War probably ends 2 years earlier than it actually did, we're also saying probably the Second World War doesn't happen. And now we're saying that, OK, you still get a revolution in Russia, but not the Bolshevik Revolution necessarily. So therefore, you don't get the Soviet Union. You don't get the Cold War. The entire 20th century looks very different, Chris Copson.
It certainly does. I mean, obviously, that's very much sort of ripples in the pond. But the idea of Russia actually transitioning into a democracy, as Chris said, she's becoming industrialised. She's starting to develop a middle class. We're spared the horrors of Stalinism. Russia could be massive. I mean, massive natural resources. Could be a very good, prosperous, democratic country.
A superpower.
A superpower.
Yeah. And that was its trajectory before the revolution. And it had the leadership and it had the political transition that we're talking about, then it's totally different. And, that's down to, as I said, the failure of nerve here in the initial stage of this campaign, that we didn't go through with it. And quite apart from all these things, the intermeshing of the political and the military is something that everybody forgets all the time. The fact that Bulgaria came in, why? Because actually the Turks prevailed at Gallipoli. Why did the revolution happen? Politically, because of a military defeat on the Eastern Front. All these things roll in together. And I think we forget, really, that politics is right at the heart of everything that happens on the battlefield. And the biggest problem that a lot of generals and admirals have is they spend all their time down on the battlefield and don't go up onto the political balcony.
Well, war is politics by other means.
That's what Clausewitz said, if you agree with him.
Absolutely. You said something really interesting a moment ago, Chris Parry, about the Middle East and what the consequences might have been for it had Gallipoli played out differently. Just expand on that.
Well, again, if we look at the Ottoman Empire, I mean, famously, the First World War is known as the graveyard of empires. So Austro-Hungarian, the German, the Russian, the Ottoman, and to an extent the British Empire, all start to fade because of the First World War. Now, again, let's look at a political transition in Turkey that doesn't involve the collapse and dissolution that we see. Now, one of the people we've mentioned already is Kemal Atatürk. He comes to the fore in the Turkish War of Independence after the First World War. He asserts himself on the back of his military reputation that he's gained at Gallipoli, but he also brings with him quite a few of the generals that are with him in Gallipoli. So that is a major movement. We've had a Young Turk movement just before the First World War to say, look, we've got to change. This is no good running it like this. But again, it means that the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, has a much easier transition if it surrenders at this point and is able to actually say, look, we're here as an equal partner in any armistice. Therefore, we want to hang on to quite a lot of the stuff we've got in the Middle East, in Palestine, in Arabia. We appreciate, Britain, that you want to have access to the oil of Iran and places like that. We'll make an agreement. And all these things start to fold in terms of agreement rather than terms that have been imposed. It's the catastrophic end of the First World War. Margaret Macmillan's written a brilliant book on the way the losing countries totally destabilised the future political map by the fact that we didn't let them down gently.
I mean, I'm thinking if we don't get the Second World War, we don't get the rise of Nazi Germany, and we have a very different lay of the land in the Middle East, presumably you don't get the creation of the State of Israel as we know it now?
I think you have a homeland for the Jews because that's already underway well before the First World War. Where that homeland is and what it looks like is totally different.
Different borders.
In terms of the Ottoman Empire's fallen, do we get the Sykes-Picot Agreement? Do we get the parceling up of
well, we don't because the mandate
that doesn't
occur.
That actually frees us from an awful lot of the problems we've got today by this peculiar way of parceling up land by just drawing straight lines across it, irrespective of who happens to live there. Israel, who can tell?
There would have been a homeland for the Jews. I think that's the case. The movement has already started and there is sympathy for that sort of approach. Where it is, what it looks like is very different. What I think is really interesting is how the relationship between Britain and Iran would have actually developed because we were so dependent on the oil from Iran. and so forth. I think that would have been developed differently, and of course it wouldn't be the Iran we have today, I suspect.
No. A couple of other things to mention. Obviously, the Anzac myth and the Anzac legend springs out of what happens at Gallipoli. That is central to modern-day New Zealand and Australian identity. So whether their sense of self is different, had the Gallipoli campaign played out differently, is worth considering. The other thing, Chris Copson, of course, if the First World War ends in 1916, the US never gets involved.
No.
And I wonder, from an American psyche point of view, does it see its place in the world very differently if it's never had to be the world's policeman?
I think that's absolutely right. If there is no US involvement in the First World War, then the tendency towards isolationism, except where it's in their interest, is going to be stronger.
I'm not sure about this. I think it would be less Europe-focused. We've got to remember, at the end of the 19th century, the Americans were getting slightly imperial with the Philippines.
Yeah.
What I think would have happened is their focus would have been towards the Asia-Pacific.
Heading in a different direction.
Yeah,
yes.
and Europe would have been something else they looked at. And so I think, you look at the Great White Fleet that went around the world in the 1900s under Theodore Roosevelt. They're actually saying we are a global power. But what you would have seen is America, I think, as a two-ocean naval power, which would have displaced the Royal Navy, which indeed it did, and its land pretensions would have actually been less. That's the key point. What America has committed to in the First World War is coming back to Europe to actually fight its own battles in Europe against the dictators, obviously in the Second World War, and of course to offset communism during the Cold War. So I think the Americans certainly would be out there, but the whole character of American globalization would be totally different. They'd be a Pacific-facing superpower, not a European
Pacific
Atlantic
and
one.
possibly further into South America as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, absolutely.
That side of the pond.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and so but in all of this, we mustn't forget we would have left quite a lot of competitive powers on the ground in Europe.
Yes.
France, Germany aren't gonna actually forget what's happened in the Franco-Prussian War, what's happened in the First World War. There's a lot of unresolved ambitions with Russia, Italy, Germany, France, and Great Britain. So there's enough friction there to start something again.
So there's going to be a clash again at some point, but we don't necessarily know when.
The phrase, the spark that ignited the powder keg is the First World War. Well, if that didn't take place, the powder keg is still there, isn't it?
Yeah.
I just want to bring it back a little bit closer to home, and you know what I'm going to talk about. I am going to talk about Colonel Mustafa Kemal, who is one of the characters I most admire from history. He establishes his military reputation on Gallipoli, and as Chris Parry said, he goes on through the Civil War. But his influence on Turkey as a state is massive.
It's ideological in some ways.
It's ideological.
Yeah.
Mustafa Kemal becomes known as Ataturk, father of the Turks, and he turns Turkey into a secular, to a certain extent, Western-facing state.
Well, Kemalism became its own ideology in the way that Gaullism became in France.
Yeah, exactly so. If he hadn't had that boost to his career as a divisional commander on Gallipoli, who knows what might have happened further on.
I just want to go back to the point about you don't get Nazi Germany, you don't get the Second World War, therefore. Are we being a bit too quick to discount the idea that you would get the rise of a kind of European fascism in Germany or in one of the great powers of Europe? Because, of course, you get Mussolini, you get Franco in Spain, you get Salazar, different kind of right-wing leader in Portugal.
There's also a fascist movement in Turkey at this time as well.
True.
Yeah.
So is it possible that you could still get a Hitler-type figure coming to prominence in somewhere like Germany?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, if you ask people in the 1920s who they thought was the leading fascist figure, it's Mussolini. And so the whole focus is different. But we have to remember that the conditions that allow the rise of fascism in all these countries are entirely down to the conditions that prevail at the end of the First World War. And also we've got the hyperinflation in a lot of countries that happens as a result of the Treaty of Versailles in Germany and other things as well. You've got a massive dispersal of populations. You've got the nationalities asserting themselves. You then end up with the Great Depression in 1929. Now, if none of this happens, the seed corn and the fertile ground for fascism and these extreme movements doesn't exist.
You think we don't get the Great Depression?
You may not, because the economic circumstances are different if you settle in 1916 and people are able to resume their lives. So, the whole rise of communism and the whole rise of fascism depends on the collapse of middle classes in all these countries and also the state of the economy and people's prospects. This all comes about because of the First World War. So without that, or if it ends earlier, the conditions for extremism in Europe, apart from nationalism, which is the big extremism, of course, don't exist.
This has been genuinely fascinating. Final thought from each of you, and then I will do my best to try and wrap this all up because there are so many different strands we could go down here. Chris Copson, your final thought on the long-term consequences of Gallipoli?
I think we've just been into it, haven't we? They're actually incalculable. I mean, the whole idea that First World War comes to an end. I mean, I don't understand enough about economics to say, no, there wouldn't have been a Great Depression. It is absolute ripples in the pond, but it's absolutely fascinating just to think on this and to explore where it might have gone. I'm not sure I am erudite enough to come to any positive conclusions, if I'm honest. Chris
Parry?
Yeah, I'm just disappointed that what could have been a very successful tactical action actually resulted in such strategic failure. All I would point out is throughout its history, the Royal Navy always commits to get the army off the beach, and it does so at Gallipoli as well.
Well, listen, we could talk about this for hours. Thank you ever so much to both of you. I think this is probably the episode of History Undone where we've had more what-ifs than any other. Let's say that the Gallipoli campaign succeeds for the Allied forces. It probably means the Ottoman Empire are indeed knocked out of the First World War. That probably brings the First World War to an end in 1916. If that happens, do you get the Treaty of Versailles? Do you get the growing resentment in Germany as a result of the terms of that treaty? As a result, as Adolf Hitler rise to power, do you get the Second World War? What happens to Winston Churchill in Britain? He was made a scapegoat for the failures of the Gallipoli campaign. Maybe he would have been Prime Minister far earlier. You don't get Lloyd George as Prime Minister in 1916 until 1922. Maybe Churchill takes over when Asquith stands down. And maybe if there is a Second World War, it's not Winston Churchill at that point who is leading Britain. What would the consequences have been for that? Massive long-term consequences for Turkey. Do you get the rise of Ataturk? Do you get the Turkey we know today? The Middle East. The borders of the Middle East could look completely different to those we know now. What about the long-term impact on the USA? They would never have got involved in the First World War. Do they see their role as a world superpower in a different way? Do they become more of a Pacific power than a Europe-focused power? And of course, you don't get the legacy of the Anzac spirit. Maybe you don't get the same formative experience of national identity for the Australians and the New Zealanders. Absolutely huge consequences all stemming from this. I haven't even mentioned what happens with Russia. Maybe the Russian Revolution does happen, but maybe it happens in a very different way. You don't get a Bolshevik revolution. You don't get the Soviet Union and the Cold War as a result. I think we can pretty much say that had the Gallipoli campaign played out differently, the entire 20th century could have looked very, very different. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. My thanks to Chris Copson and Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry for joining me. And we will be back undoing more battles from history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, History Undone with James Hanson on YouTube. And you can also catch me presenting Frontline on Times Radio. Goodbye.